So, thanks for coming out on Sunday to the Laboratory for Lacanian Politics. We're going to start with Roger Litten doing his second lecture on reading Jean-Claude Milner's paper, The Traps of the All. So we're going to focus on the next 4 sentences. That's my prediction. Okay, over to you, Roger. Thank you.
You'd be surprised. I was surprised. Let's surprise ourselves. We're not going to recap anything, but we're just going to take up some of the same questions and try to push them forward a little bit. The perhaps primary reason for taking up this Milner text is that he takes up Lacan's doctrine of the all, the alls in the plural, and puts it to work in the social and political field, effectively via a critique of the all, around the central proposition, the all is not one. And that critique of the notion of the all turns out to be, by definition, intrinsically a political critique. So, basic proposition from the first page, there is a fracture intrinsic to the use of the word tous, all, whole. We already touched on some of the multiple senses between the notion of all and the notion of whole, two English translations of the same term, and also between the singular and the plural. So there is a fracture intrinsic to the use of this word all, which infects all deployments of this term in the field of political discourse. We could say, in a way, it almost provides us with a definition of a central difficulty of the field of politics more generally. So, the word all is not univocal. Notion that the word all and all its variants are not univocal. The built-in instability in the use of this term in political discourse. We touched on the grammatical and logical indicators of multivalence of use, in particular the use of the definite and the indefinite article to mark its singular and plural forms. This analysis could provide a minimal framework for exploring a range of different cases in order to track the instability inherent in the use of this term all in its deployment throughout the political and social fields, exposing both the ambiguities of its articulation, but also the attempts to suture over these difficulties with artificial solutions. It would allow us to locate what we could call false weldings of the different senses, different uses of the term all, which effectively either throw up anomalies in the discourses in which they occur, or tend to come apart under pressure, exposing unforeseen ruptures, and we could suggest that this is a slippage intrinsic to the notion of democracy itself, government of the all. We could, in fact, suggest that the most prevalent of these artificial solutions to weld together the different uses of the term all is democracy itself, the operator of democracy, however we define it, the government of the people, the government of the many, the government of the all, is made up of various political, procedural, mathematical, and rhetorical devices to make one out of many, to manage the fracture at the heart of the human community, a fracture that's central to any characterization of politics and political discourse. So we're tracing the broad arc from the critique of the notion of all to a critical examination of the notion of democracy itself. A composition of a singular term out of multiple or plural entities, which, as I suggested, could be said to be the central operation of democracy itself, an operation for making one out of many, and hence the central point around which forces of fracture and dissent are being played out both locally and across Europe today. In due course, we could consider a parallel analysis of the term the people, which to some extent is organized on exactly the same threshold between a limited whole and an unlimited whole. Even the distinction between the same grammatical indicator between people in general and the people of the nation, all the way to the introduction of the notion of the will of the people, which we're having, in a sense, thrust down our throat without anyone really coming to grips with what is this will of the people and how is it produced. We could link this question of a critique of the notion of the people with the rise of populism as a political phenomenon, because we can see that there are similar questions of the same fundamental dynamic at play, even in terms of the split between populism as an expression of democratic principles, an assertion of democratic rights, or populism as a perversion of the principles of democracy. We could say is an inherent instability to even any attempt to grasp what is populism and what is it in democracy that leaves it vulnerable to the shift to populism. One further shift would be the collapse into totalitarianism. We would like to line up those three aspects around the same logic, which we would again presume the logic of the not all provides us with that template. So, the key development here at the heart of Milner's analysis is the reading of Lacan's logical formulae, his analysis of the term all, reducing the divergence, the heterogeneity between the various uses of the term all to two key versions, two forms, two modalities of the all, as deployed in his formulae of sexuation, aligned, as you presumably know, with his analysis of masculine sexuation on one hand and feminine sexuation. And this distinction between two modalities of the all in relation primarily to the role and status of the limit. We have a logic of closed sets, limited wholes on the one hand, on the masculine side, and a logic of unlimited wholes, the open series, on the other. Thus, in its first aspect, the masculine logic of closed sets, the all supposes a limit. We're reading this off the very first page of this text, which you will all be familiar with by now, and out of the first sentence of the second paragraph of the section 1. So in its first modality, the all supposes a limit. So this introduces the first modality of the all as indexed on a limit, thus introducing the role of the limit as distinguishing the two forms of all, the limited all and the unlimited all, which will receive the name not all. Bringing this question of the all in relation to the limit that modifies it means that it's the limit that primarily distinguishes the two forms, which leads us to the next step highlighted by Milner, which goes as follows. This means that despite appearances, the operator for all does not have any meaning when used in a single formula. It only takes on meaning when two formulas are correlated to each other. In other words, the postulation of the all, the universal term, requires a second formula that qualifies and limits it. This will be the function of the existential proposition. So formulated in terms of propositional logic, starting with the left-hand side of the table, the logic of masculine sexuation, the two lines of the formula, written in propositional terms, can be read as follows. For all x, phi x, or just the function of x. In other words, for all x, fx is satisfied. And then the existential qualifier, there exists an x such that non-x, the bar of negation over the function. In other words, there exists an x for which the function is not satisfied. Thus, from the start, the question turns on the notion of satisfaction. With that notion of satisfaction in the propositional sense, we have the first indication, shall we say, of the overlap between pure logic and Lacan's deployment of these terms in the psychoanalytic field. So, on the one hand, he formulates these questions in the language of propositional logic, but as always, modifying the terms for his own uses. In the appendix to the book from which this text is taken, not translated in the chapters that we have, Jean-Claude Milner highlights three aspects of Lacan's procedure, in which, one, at the level of the universal, Lacan obviously modifies the status of the universal from one side of the table to the other by introducing the term of negation. So we see the deployment of the function of negation at the level of the all, which is then how we arrive at the notion of the not all. But more importantly, at the level of the existential function, Milner highlights that the formula, there exists x such that, a standard formula of propositional logic. In this formula, Lacan takes existence in the strict sense of the term, as a function of existence per se. Second aspect, the negation of this function, the not fx, is then taken as a saying no to the universal function, which allows Lacan to set up the existence of an x that says no, hence as a limitation in the positive sense of the limit, as an affirmation of the limit rather than the limit shall we say, in a passive sense. Here also, we can just note the articulation between the writing and the saying, not just in terms of the different nuances that are given to these questions in the written and spoken versions of Lacan's elaboration, in the seminars and then in the écrit, but more fundamentally at the level of the logic of the propositional functions themselves. We know that the development of logic and of the propositional functions are themselves elaborated on the basis of a writing, which to some extent suppresses the function of enunciation. If anything, we see Lacan putting enunciation back in the picture, with the saying no as the affirmation of a limit. Of course, this saying no to the function also serves to bring into view the fact of saying, the role of enunciation, but also the saying no to the function of castration, which opens up the question of the link to the name of the father, the no of the father, both as operator of castration and as exempt from castration. You may know something about the paradoxical status of the father in the Oedipal logic, situated in the place of the exception, in the enunciation outside the set, a position of exception on which the constitution of that set is predicated, and then further dynamics that can be elaborated around this paradoxical status at the root of the function of the father, the name of the father, and its subsequent critique in Lacan's work. This trajectory of the critique of the function of the father, the name of the father, comes to culminate in the reduction of these questions to the propositional formula, the saying no. And to some extent, in L'Atelier, Lacan says that everything that had been formulated in Freud and in the early part of Lacan's work under the rubric of Oedipus is summed up in these two formulae. It's quite a striking claim for us to even consider unpacking. So we have these...
Can I ask you to say that again?
I'm not sure what I said.